My sister Chloe stood arm in arm with my ex-boyfriend, a triumphant smirk on her face. "We're getting married," she announced to our entire family at the Christmas dinner. I was almost uninvited to. My father clapped my ex on the back, calling him the son he always wanted, while my mother looked at me with pity and said, "Well, dear, not everyone is destined for success." That was the moment the floor fell out from under me. It wasn't just that my sister was marrying the man who had shattered my heart. It was the way my family looked at me, like I was a ghost at their feast, a failure they had to tolerate. Have you ever felt so small that you start to wonder if you're even real? They thought they had buried me that night. They were wrong. They just didn't know they were burying a seed. The Reyes family Christmas dinner was always less of a celebration and more of a performance. The stage was my parents' sprawling home, decorated to within an inch of its life with white lights, silver garlands, and towering fir trees that smelled aggressively of pine. Every surface gleamed, every ornament was perfectly placed. It was a beautiful, sterile perfection that always made my teeth ache. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, a designated spot that felt more like exile than inclusion. My presence was a reluctant courtesy. I'd been laid off from my low-level admin job 2 months prior, and in the eyes of my parents, Mark and Diane Reyes, unemployment wasn't a temporary setback, it was a character flaw. "It's just so hard to see your children struggle," my mother, Diane, said to my Aunt Carol, her voice loud enough to carry down the table. She wasn't looking at me, but the words were arrows aimed directly at my heart. "You raise them to have drive, to have ambition. Chloe, for instance. She's always known what she wanted." My sister Chloe preened. She was the golden child, a successful real estate agent with a flashy car and an even flashier smile. She was everything I wasn't: outgoing, conventionally beautiful, and skilled in the art of making our parents proud. Across from me, my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She shot me a quick, pained look before staring down at her plate. Aunt Carol lived under my parents' financial thumb after a messy divorce, and her silence was the price of her security. She was a bystander to my slow-motion execution, and her averted eyes felt almost as sharp as my mother's words. My father, Mark, chimed in, swirling the wine in his glass. "Direction, Diane. That's the key. You need to have direction. Look at Leo." He beamed at the man sitting beside Chloe. "Leo Vance. My Leo. Or he had been my Leo. For 5 years. He was an army captain, handsome in that clean-cut, confident way that my parents adored. His uniform wasn't just clothing, it was a symbol of everything they valued: structure, authority, and undeniable success. He was the human equivalent of their perfectly decorated house. "Leo is a fine young man," my father continued, "a real go-getter, knows what it takes to get ahead." I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. Leo had broken up with me 6 months ago. The reason he gave was vague, something about us wanting different things. The truth, the one that came out in our final ugly argument, was that my quiet ambition made him uncomfortable. I had dreams of starting my own company, a small logistics firm based on the systems and models I'd been designing since college. He'd called it a silly little hobby. He told me a successful man needs a supportive woman, not a competitor. He wanted a cheerleader, not a co-pilot. He had found his cheerleader in my sister. Chloe chose that moment to stand up, her hand finding Leo's. She tapped her fork against her crystal water glass, the sound cutting through the low hum of conversation. "Everyone," she said, her voice practically singing with joy. "Leo and I have something we'd love to share." The room fell silent. Leo stood beside her, his arm wrapping around her waist. He had a proprietary look on his face, a look I knew all too well. He was staking his claim. "We're getting married," Chloe announced, holding up her left hand. A diamond the size of a small planet glittered under the chandelier. The room erupted. My parents leaped to their feet, rushing to embrace them. My cousins cheered. It was a perfectly orchestrated moment of family joy, and I was the single discordant note in the symphony. My father clapped Leo on the back with genuine booming enthusiasm. "The son I always wanted," he roared, and the words struck me with the force of a physical blow. I had always been a disappointment to him, the quiet, bookish daughter who preferred flowcharts to parties. He had never understood my mind, and so he had decided it had no value. My mother, her face flushed with excitement, turned to me. She didn't hug me. She placed a hand on my arm, her touch a mix of pity and condescension. "Well, dear," she said, her voice a stage whisper, "not everyone is destined for success, but I'm so glad you could be here to see what it looks like." I felt the blood drain from my face, my breath caught in my throat. I looked past her to Leo. He was watching me, a flicker of something triumph, maybe even cruelty in his eyes. Then came the toast. My father raised his glass. To Chloe and Leo. A power couple. A perfect match. Everyone drank. I couldn't lift my glass, my hands were trembling too much. Then Leo spoke. He thanked my parents for welcoming him into the family. He talked about his future with Chloe, and then he looked directly at me, his gaze pinning me to my chair. "I'm just so grateful to have finally found a woman like Chloe," he said, his voice smooth and clear, "someone who is strong and supportive, who understands what's truly important. A woman who knows her place is beside her man, lifting him up." The insult was so precise, so public, it stole the air from my lungs. He was throwing our last argument in my face, twisting my ambition into a flaw, and presenting my sister as the ideal I could never be. The room was filled with applause, but all I could hear was a roaring in my ears. I had to get out. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. I mumbled something about needing some air. As I tried to slip away toward the hall, Chloe's hand shot out and grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her nails digging into my skin. "Leaving so soon, Ava?" she asked, her voice syrupy sweet, but loud enough for the nearest cluster of relatives to hear. "Don't be a sore loser. It's a bad look." Laughter followed her words. Polite, tittering laughter. They were mocking me. My own family. I pulled my arm free and walked, not ran, out of the dining room, through the gleaming foyer, and out the front door into the biting December cold. I didn't grab my coat. The shock had made me numb to the temperature. The sound of their celebration, their laughter, followed me down the long driveway. Each burst of joy felt like another stone being thrown at my back. I stood there under a streetlight, the snow starting to fall in delicate, silent flakes, and I finally let myself breathe. I wasn't just kicked out, I was erased. They had held a funeral for my worth, and they were dancing on the grave. Standing there in the cold, a profound and terrible clarity washed over me. This wasn't just a bad night, this was a verdict. In their world, I was a nobody, a failure, a ghost at their feast. That night, huddled in the freezing dark, I made a promise to the only person I had left to count on, myself. They would never, ever make me feel this small again. The life they knew for Ava Reyes was over. A new one was about to begin. The days following that Christmas dinner were a blur of gray. My tiny one-bedroom apartment, which once felt like a cozy sanctuary, now seemed like a prison cell. It was on the top floor of a creaking old building, with slanted ceilings that forced me to stoop in places. The single window looked out onto a brick wall. The place was a perfect metaphor for my life. Small, forgotten, with no view of the future. I was broke. The last of my severance pay was gone, and rent was due in 2 weeks. Jobless, I'd sent out dozens of resumes for admin positions, anything to stop the financial bleeding, but the market was tight, and my resume was unimpressive, and completely, utterly alone. I hadn't spoken to my family since I'd walked out of their house. They hadn't called. Their silence was its own kind of message. You are not worth the effort. I spent 3 days in bed, replaying every moment of that dinner. My mother's pitying smile, my father's booming praise for Leo, Chloe's triumphant, glittering diamond, and Leo's words, twisting my dreams into a character flaw. Each memory was a fresh turn of the knife. The humiliation didn't fade. It festered, turning into a cold, hard knot of anger in my chest. On the 4th day, the anger finally outweighed the despair. I couldn't stay in bed forever. The landlord wouldn't accept misery as payment. I got up and looked around my apartment, my eyes cataloging every object. What could I sell? the decent microwave my parents had given me for my college graduation, the small collection of classic novels I'd treasured for years. I pulled a dusty cardboard box out of the back of my closet, its sides bulging. It was labeled College Misc. I figured it was full of old textbooks I could try to sell online for a few dollars. I tore open the tape. Inside, beneath a layer of old syllabi, were my notebooks. Not for my classes, but for me. The covers were worn, the pages filled with my small, neat handwriting and precise, intricate drawings. I sat on the floor and opened one. It wasn't just notes, it was a world. There were complex logistical diagrams, mapping out the most efficient delivery routes for a hypothetical fleet of trucks. There were supply chain solutions for imaginary humanitarian crises, complete with cost-benefit analyses and risk assessments. There were efficiency models designed to streamline warehouse operations, reducing waste and maximizing output. This was my boring hobby, the thing my family had always dismissed with a confused wave of the hand. "Why would you do that for fun, Ava?" my mother used to ask. "It's so unladylike." Leo had called it my nerd stuff. But looking at it now, I didn't see a hobby. I saw a skill. I saw a system. I saw a way of thinking that was uniquely powerfully mine. I had always been able to see the patterns in chaos, the hidden pathways that connected disparate points. I could design systems that were elegant, efficient, and resilient. While Chloe was learning how to charm people, I was learning how to make things work. For the first time in a long, long time, a flicker of something that wasn't shame or anger ignited inside me. It was a spark of pride. They could mock it, they could dismiss it, but they couldn't take this from me. This was mine. The knot in my chest began to change. The cold anger was still there, but now it had a purpose. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival. I got up off the floor, leaving the notebook spread out like a battle plan. I went to my laptop, the screen illuminating my face in the dim room. I didn't search for admin jobs. I started searching for something else. I typed in government logistics contracts, private military contractors, supply chain modernization. I spent the next week glued to that screen, fueled by cheap coffee and a desperate rising hope. I devoured articles, white papers, and industry reports. I was building a map of a world I'd only ever dreamed about, and I was discovering that my nerd stuff had a name: logistics and acquisitions. It was a multi-billion-dollar industry. Late one night, deep down a rabbit hole of military trade publications, I stumbled upon an article. The headline was intriguing: "The Maverick and the Pentagon: Why Colonel Thorne's Genius Was Too Much for the Brass." It detailed the career of a Colonel Marcus Thorne, a man they called a logistics visionary, a genius at streamlining complex military supply chains. But his methods were unorthodox, his personality abrasive. He was, the article said, pushed into a scandalous forced retirement by less innovative but better connected rivals who felt threatened by his brilliance. The article quoted some of his revolutionary ideas, his philosophies on creating resilient, predictive supply networks. I felt a jolt of recognition. His ideas were my ideas, but magnified, tested, and applied on a global scale. He was the architect. I was the student, who had been unknowingly studying his work from afar. He became my new obsession. Where was he now? The article said he had gone off the grid. I didn't care. The spark inside me had become a fire. This man, this Colonel Thorne, he was the key. He would understand. He had been betrayed by the very system he was trying to fix. We were two sides of the same coin. I looked at my dwindling bank account balance on my phone screen. I had just enough for a one-way bus ticket, and maybe a week in a cheap motel. It was insane. It was a wild, desperate gamble. But as I looked at the brick wall outside my window, I knew I had to take it. Staying here was a guaranteed failure. Chasing a ghost in Virginia was at least a chance. I was done being a victim. I was going to find Colonel Thorne. I was going to build something. Finding a man who doesn't want to be found is a logistical problem, and solving logistical problems was the one thing I was truly good at. Colonel Marcus Thorne had vanished from the public eye. But the internet never truly forgets. He had left behind a trail of digital breadcrumbs, faint but traceable. I spent 3 weeks of obsessive, non-stop work piecing them together. I cross-referenced old articles with archived posts on obscure military forums where he'd once debated supply chain theory under a pseudonym. I tracked the IP addresses from those old posts, which led me to a regional internet provider. From there, I used public property records, searching for recent purchases by men matching his age and profile. It was a long shot, but my mind thrives on connecting disparate data points. Finally, I found it. A small, cash-only property purchase in an unassuming town called Cedar Creek, Virginia. The name on the deed was M. Thorne. It had to be him. I drained my savings account. The number was pathetically small, but it was everything I had. I bought a one-way bus ticket and packed a single bag with a change of clothes and my laptop, which now held my life's work. The bus ride was 24 hours of watching the country scroll by, my stomach churning with a mixture of terror and adrenaline. The cheap motel I checked into in Cedar Creek smelled of stale cigarettes and regret. For a moment, sitting on the lumpy bed, the sheer insanity of what I was doing washed over me. I was a broke, jobless woman who had just spent her last dollar to chase a disgraced colonel across 3 states. I was either the bravest person I knew or the biggest fool. The next morning, I found him. It was almost anticlimactic. He was sitting in a corner booth of the town's only diner, a place called the Copper Kettle. He looked nothing like the stern, uniformed man from the news articles. He was just an older guy in a faded flannel shirt and worn jeans, with a tired, grizzled look on his face. He was nursing a cup of black coffee and reading a newspaper. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I walked over to his table, my hands shaking. "Colonel Thorne?" I asked. He looked up, his eyes a sharp, intelligent blue. They were wary, annoyed. "Who's asking?" His voice was a low growl. "My name is Ava Reyes." He grunted and went back to his paper. "Don't know you. I'm retired." It was a clear dismissal. This was it, the moment of truth. I didn't beg. I didn't plead. I had learned from my family that weakness invites contempt. Instead, I presented a solution. I took a deep breath and placed my tablet on the table in front of him. "I know you're retired, sir, but I also know that you designed the initial logistics framework for Operation Desert Shield. And I know your plan was altered by the Pentagon, leading to a 17% increase in supply line inefficiencies. I've read your white papers on predictive resourcing." He slowly lowered his newspaper. His eyes narrowed. I had his attention. "I've prepared something for you," I said, my voice steadier now. I tapped the screen, bringing up a presentation I had spent the entire bus ride perfecting. It was titled, "The Red River Bottleneck, a Practical Application of Thorne Model Logistics." "There's a critical flaw in a current military supply chain for a training exercise in Texas," I explained, my words coming faster. "It's a classic bottleneck problem. The official solution is to increase convoy frequency, which increases cost and risk. But the problem isn't the frequency, it's the distribution hub. Based on your writings, I've designed a decentralized mobile resupply model that would not only solve the bottleneck, but would cut costs by a third." He picked up the tablet, his expression unreadable. For a long time, he just scrolled, his gaze intense. He swiped through my diagrams, my cost projections, my risk mitigation charts. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. I could hear the clatter of plates in the diner kitchen, the low murmur of other patrons. Finally, he looked up from the screen, his eyes locking onto mine. "The Pentagon doesn't want solutions, kid," he said, his voice hard. "It wants contractors who play the game. It wants inflated budgets and familiar faces. They'd rather fail conventionally than succeed unconventionally." The bitterness in his voice was raw. He was speaking from a deep, personal wound. I held his gaze. "With all due respect, sir, I don't think you believe that, or you wouldn't have written the papers in the first place." He stared at me for another long moment, and then a slow, grim smile touched his lips. It wasn't a happy smile, but it was a start. He began to grill me. For the next hour, he threw questions at me like grenades. What about weather contingencies? What's your failsafe for a communications blackout? How do you account for human error in your system? He was testing me, pushing me, trying to find a hole in my logic. I answered every question. I defended my model. I showed him my work. When he was done, he leaned back in the booth and let out a long breath. He looked from me to the tablet and back again. They called my ideas untenable, he said, his voice quiet. Too radical, too complex. You've made them practical. You built the engine for the car I only ever designed on paper. He told me his story then. He told me about the years of being undermined by less competent, more politically savvy officers. He told me about the brilliant plans that were shelved, the warnings that were ignored. He told me about the day he was called into an office and politely, brutally, forced into early retirement, his legacy tarnished by rumors and lies. He had been cast out just like me. He slid the tablet back across the table. So what do you want, Ava Reyes? Money? A job? I want a partner, I said, my voice clear and certain. I have the systems. You have the experience and the contacts. Together, we can build something they can't ignore. He studied my face, and I think he saw the same fire in my eyes that was burning in his own gut. It was the fire of the outcast, the fury of the underestimated. He made his offer, not as a savior, but as a fellow soldier preparing for a new war. All right, he said, extending a calloused hand across the table. We build this together, 50-50 split. But let's be clear, this isn't a charity. I expect a return on my investment in you. No excuses, no crying, just results. You work for me, I work for you. We succeed or fail together. I shook his hand, his grip was like iron. Results are all I have, sir, I replied. In that greasy spoon diner, over cold coffee and the ghost of 1,000 forgotten breakfasts, our company was born. We called it Apex Logistics. It was a name that promised a new peak, a new standard. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just Ava Reyes, the failed daughter. I was a founder. The first 18 months of Apex Logistics were a baptism by fire. Our world headquarters was Colonel Thorne's two-car garage. The air was a constant mix of the smell of old motor oil, the bitter aroma of burnt coffee, and the electric hum of overworked computer servers. We lived and breathed the company. My life became a relentless cycle of 20-hour days, fueled by instant noodles and a burning desire to prove everyone wrong. I slept on a lumpy futon in the corner, often waking up with the imprint of a keyboard on my cheek. This wasn't the glamorous startup life you see in movies, this was the grind. It was dirty, exhausting, and the most alive I had ever felt. Thorne was the voice and the face. He spent his days on the phone, leveraging a network of old contacts he hadn't spoken to in years. He called in favors, traded on a reputation for brilliance that even his enemies couldn't deny, and hunted for the small, undesirable contracts the big players wouldn't touch. He was our strategist, our salesman, our connection to the world that had cast us both out. I was the engine. While Thorne opened the doors, I built the machine that would carry us through them. I became a sponge for information. I enrolled in a slew of online courses, my nights filled with virtual lectures on federal acquisition regulations, corporate law, and advanced data analytics. I learned the labyrinthine language of government paperwork until I could recite contract clauses in my sleep. But my real work, my true purpose, was building our proprietary software. I wasn't just the co-founder, I became the lead architect, the project manager, and the entire IT department. I coded until my vision blurred, designing the logistics platform that would become the heart of Apex. It was a beautiful, complex system that could analyze, predict, and optimize supply chains with an elegance and efficiency that no off-the-shelf software could match. It was my old notebooks brought to life. The work was brutal. There were days of profound loneliness, where the only voice I heard was Thorne's, and the silence of the garage felt deafening. The exhaustion was a physical weight, a constant ache in my bones. I remember one night, around 3 a.m., I was trying to debug a critical piece of code. My eyes were burning, my mind was foggy, and I just slumped forward, falling asleep with my head on the desk. I woke up an hour later to Thorn gently placing a blanket over my shoulders. He didn't say anything, just refilled my coffee mug and went back to his own work. In that silent gesture, I felt more support and respect than my family had ever shown me. My old life felt like a distant dream. My family would call occasionally. I'd see Chloe's name flash on my phone screen, and a wave of the old anxiety would wash over me. I never answered. I would send a short, non-committal text back. Sorry, busy with a project. Talk soon. They didn't press. In their minds, I was still the aimless daughter, probably working some dead-end temp job, too ashamed to admit my failure. That little project of hers, I imagined my mother saying with a sigh. I do hope she finds a real job soon. Their ignorance became our greatest weapon. Our secrecy was our shield. While they pictured me drifting through life, I was building an empire in a garage in Virginia. We started small, taking the jobs no one else wanted, delivering non-critical spare parts to a remote National Guard armory, transporting outdated training materials. Each job was a test, and each time, we delivered with flawless military-grade precision. Our deliveries were never late. Our paperwork was never wrong. Our communication was crystal clear. Slowly, quietly, a whisper started to circulate through the lower echelons of the procurement world. There was a new company, Apex Logistics, run by that disgraced Colonel Thorne and some unknown partner. They were small, but they were good, infallibly good. We weren't just building a company, we were forging a reputation, one small, perfect delivery at a time. After a year of grinding it out on minor contracts, we finally got our shot. It wasn't a massive multi-million-dollar deal, but it was significant, a stepping stone into the next league. We landed a contract to deliver critical medical supplies, including temperature-sensitive vaccines and insulin, to a series of remote National Guard training bases scattered across the Midwest. The logistics were complex, the stakes were high, and it was our chance to prove the Apex model could handle a mission that mattered. For the first 2 months, everything ran like clockwork. Our software anticipated every need, our drivers were efficient, and our reputation for reliability was solidifying with every successful delivery. We were on track to not only fulfill the contract perfectly, but also turn a healthy profit money we desperately needed to expand. Then halfway through the contract, the crisis hit. I was in our makeshift office, which had since been upgraded from the garage to a small rented space above a laundromat, when the call came in. It was from our primary supplier for the specialized cooling units used to transport the insulin. The man on the phone sounded nervous. There was a manufacturing defect, he explained. A critical component in their latest batch was failing quality control tests. They couldn't guarantee the stability of the units. It would take them at least a month to produce a new reliable batch. A month we didn't have. My blood ran cold, but then the supplier offered a solution. Look, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We have an alternative, an older model. It's not as robust, and frankly, the temperature regulation is a bit inconsistent, but it's cheaper, a lot cheaper. We can sell them to you at a 70% discount to make up for the trouble. I did the math in my head instantly. Switching to the cheaper units would save us nearly $100,000. For a company like ours, living on a shoestring budget, that was a fortune. It was the difference between breaking even and having the capital to bid on bigger contracts. It was our future. Thorne walked in as I was hanging up the phone. He saw the look on my face. I explained the situation, laying out the 2 options: delay the shipment and risk breaching our contract, or use the cheaper, less reliable units and pocket a massive profit. Thorne listened, his expression unreadable. He walked over to the whiteboard where we had our company principles scrawled. The number 1 principle was integrity above all. He looked at the board, then back at me. He was testing me. This wasn't just a business decision, it was a test of my character, of the very foundation of the company we were trying to build. It's a huge profit, Ava, he said, his voice neutral. The kind of profit that keeps the lights on for another year. No one would know, not until some poor reservist's insulin goes bad in the summer and he goes into shock during a training exercise. But by then the contract is over, and we're long gone. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He was echoing the cynical logic of the very contractors he despised, the ones who cut corners and put lives at risk for the sake of the bottom line. He was showing me the path of temptation. I thought about the stories he'd told me, of soldiers in the field, let down by shoddy equipment provided by contractors who cared more about their stock price than the lives of the people they served. I looked at the contract on my desk, at the Apex Logistics letterhead, at my name printed on the documents. This wasn't just a company, it was a promise. I looked Thorne in the eye. "No," I said, my voice shaking slightly but firm. "We don't do that." I picked up the phone and dialed the contracting officer at the Department of Defense, a stern but fair man named Mr. Henderson. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I was about to turn a profitable contract into a financial loss. "Mr. Henderson," I began, my voice clear and professional. "This is Ava Reyes from Apex Logistics. I'm calling to inform you of a supply chain issue regarding the cooling units for our next delivery." I laid it all out. The manufacturer's defect, the potential risks of the alternative units, everything. I didn't sugarcoat it, I didn't make excuses. Then I told him our solution. Apex will be sourcing a different, more expensive unit from an alternate, fully vetted supplier. There will be a slight delay of 48 hours while we reroute the shipment, but we will absorb 100% of the additional cost. The integrity of the medical supplies is our top priority. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could feel our profit margin evaporating with every passing second. Finally, Mr. Henderson spoke, his voice filled with something I had never heard from a government official, genuine surprise. "Miss Reyes," he said slowly, "I've been a contracting officer for 20 years. I have never, not once, had a contractor call me to voluntarily report a problem and offer to eat the cost. Most would have used the cheap units and never said a word." He paused. "Your company's transparency is noted and appreciated." When I hung up the phone, the office was quiet. We had lost money on the deal, a painful financial hit that would set us back for months. But as I looked at Thorne, I saw a rare, genuine smile on his face. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement. "You passed," his expression said. We hadn't made a profit, but we had earned something far more valuable. We had earned a reputation for absolute, unshakable integrity. And in the world we were trying to conquer, that was currency you couldn't buy. Our integrity paid dividends faster than we could have imagined. Mr. Henderson became an internal champion for Apex. The story of the cooling units spread, a quiet legend about the small company that put the mission before profit. Doors that had been firmly shut began to creak open. We were no longer seen as just Thorne's pet project. We were seen as reliable, we were trusted. And that trust led us to the brink of our biggest breakthrough yet, a multi-year, multi-million-dollar contract to overhaul the logistics for an entire sector of the Army's training command. This was it, the contract that would take us out of the rented office and into the major leagues. It would make our company. We were one of 3 finalists, and the buzz was that our innovative, cost-saving proposal had made us the front-runner. The sense of hope was intoxicating. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I wasn't constantly worried about making payroll. A future where Apex was a stable, respected force in the industry. The feeling was so good, so novel, that I almost missed the warning signs. The first came in the form of a phone call from my sister, Chloe. I hadn't spoken to her in months, and her sudden interest was immediately suspicious. "Ava, I was just thinking about you," she said, her voice dripping with the fake, sugary sweetness she used when she wanted something. "Mom said you were still playing with that little computer project of yours. How is that going?" "It's going well, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "That's great," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe me. "You know, Leo was just promoted. He's doing so well. He has some friends at the Pentagon now, important people. He was saying the other day that it's such a tough business, what you're trying to do. He said companies like yours are a dime a dozen, and that most of them fail." The message was clear, wrapped in a flimsy veneer of concern. It was a threat. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Thanks for the vote of confidence, Chloe," I said dryly. "I'm just worried about you. she cooed. I'd hate to see you get your hopes up and be disappointed again. 2 days later, the other shoe dropped. Thorne and I were in the office, finalizing our presentation for the last round of reviews, when my phone rang. It was our official point of contact at the Pentagon. I answered, a smile on my face, expecting good news. Ms. Reyes, the man said, his voice flat and bureaucratic. I'm calling to inform you that Apex Logistics' bid for the TRADOC contract is being put on indefinite hold. My smile vanished. Hold? What do you mean? We're finalists. An anonymous formal complaint has been filed with the review board, he recited, as if reading from a script. The complaint raises concerns about your company's lack of verifiable long-term experience and cites questionable leadership with a history of insubordination. Questionable leadership. A history of insubordination. It was a direct poisoned arrow aimed at Thorne's forced retirement, and the lack of experience was a jab at me. It was too specific, too targeted. I knew with a certainty that settled in my gut like a block of ice that this was Leo's doing. He had used his new rank, his important friends to whisper poison into the right ears. He had sabotaged us. Who filed the complaint? I demanded, my voice tight. As I said, Ms. Reyes. The complaint was anonymous. The line went dead. I relayed the news to Thorne. He slammed his fist on the table, his face a mask of cold fury. That little snake, he seethed. He used his rank to poison the well. He couldn't compete, so he cheated. We lost the contract. The news came a week later. It had been awarded to one of our competitors, a larger, less innovative firm with deep political connections. For a week it felt like the end. The morale in our small office plummeted. The money we had been counting on was gone. The future that had seemed so bright was now shrouded in fog. We had been so close, only to have the prize snatched away by the petty jealousy of the man who had already taken so much from me. The narrative my family had written for me, the story of Ava Reyes, the failure, suddenly felt suffocatingly, crushingly real. It was a bitter, painful taste of defeat, and for a terrifying moment, huddled in the gloom of our office, I almost started to believe it was true. The sabotage was a devastating blow, but after the initial shock and anger subsided, something else took its place, a cold, hard clarity. Thorne and I sat in our quiet office, the loss of the contract hanging in the air between us. The path we had been on, the one where we played by the rules and hoped for the best, was a dead end. The system wasn't just flawed, it was actively hostile to outsiders like us. Thorne leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a familiar, rebellious fire. The system is rigged, Ava, he said, his voice a low growl. They will always protect their own. They'll let mediocrity win as long as it's familiar, so we stop playing their game. He stood up and walked to the whiteboard, erasing our old plans with a furious swipe of his hand. We build our own. That conversation marked our great pivot. It was the moment we transformed from a hopeful government contractor into a ruthless private entity. We would no longer beg for scraps from the Department of Defense. We would take our revolutionary logistics software, forged in the fires of the grind and perfected on small, thankless jobs, to a market that valued results above all else, the world of corporate disaster response and high-stakes international private security. We targeted massive, global corporations, energy conglomerates, shipping magnates, financial institutions that had priceless assets and sprawling supply chains in the most unstable regions of the world. These companies couldn't afford the Pentagon's slow, bureaucratic approach. They needed speed, precision, and absolute discretion. They needed Apex. Our military-grade efficiency and our now legendary reputation for integrity made us an irresistible choice. We didn't just offer to move boxes, we offered certainty in a world of chaos. Our breakthrough came from a colossal global energy conglomerate that was losing millions to disruptions in its supply chain in Southeast Asia. We didn't just offer them a plan, we showed them, using our software to run a simulation that predicted and neutralized 3 major potential crises before they could even happen. They were stunned. They signed us to a 5-year exclusive contract that was so massive, so lucrative, it made the Pentagon contract look like a rounding error. The money was staggering. With that single contract, everything changed. We expanded at a breathtaking pace, operating with the extreme discretion the corporate world demanded. We moved out of the office above the laundromat and into a sleek, anonymous glass tower in a different city. We hired the best, poaching talent from our larger, slower rivals. But I was no longer just the CEO or the lead architect. My role evolved. In this new world of high-stakes private logistics, where our teams were navigating everything from natural disasters to political coups, security was paramount. The head of operations needed a call sign, a name for the radio that was stripped of personal identity. One night, during a particularly tense operation, coordinating an emergency evacuation from a flood zone, Thorne was on a satellite phone barking orders. "I need an updated risk assessment on all 3 routes now. Get me the general on the line," he yelled to an aide. He meant me. I was the one commanding the entire operational and strategic map from our command center, the one making the life-or-death decisions. He had started calling me that half-jokingly, a nod to my strategic oversight. But in that moment of crisis, the name solidified. It stuck. To the teams in the field, to our corporate clients, I was no longer Ava Reyes. I was the general. The title was an acknowledgement of the authority I had earned, the power I now wielded. We became an empire in the shadows. We used our massive influx of capital to grow, acquiring smaller tech firms, security companies, and even, as a savvy real estate investment and a way to diversify our assets, a small exclusive chain of luxury resorts. All of it was done quietly, through a complex web of holding corporations and subsidiary entities. On paper, Ava Reyes was a ghost. My name appeared on no public documents, but in reality, from my minimalist office overlooking the city, I commanded a private logistics empire that spanned the globe. My family thought I was a failure. The truth was, I had become more powerful than they could possibly imagine. A year passed, a year of silent, explosive growth. I had built a new life, a new identity, in a world my family didn't even know existed. Then, one afternoon, a package arrived at my new penthouse apartment. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, addressed to Ava Reyes in my mother's perfect, looping calligraphy. Inside was an invitation, embossed with gold lettering. It was for Chloe and Leo's official engagement party. I read the details, and a slow, cold laugh escaped my lips. They weren't hosting it at the local country club or some stuffy reception hall. The venue was the Haven at Ocean's Edge, an ultra-exclusive, world-renowned waterfront resort. A place known for its privacy, its prestige, and its breathtaking views. A place I knew intimately. It was the flagship property of the luxury resort chain my company had acquired 6 months ago. They had no idea they were throwing their party in my house. The invitation felt like a final, arrogant summons. It was their last chance to parade me around as the family failure, the cautionary tale, before Chloe ascended to her throne as the perfect wife of a successful military officer. It was a final public branding of my supposed worthlessness. For a fleeting moment, the old Ava surfaced. A wave of anxiety, cold and familiar, washed over me. The thought of facing them all, of enduring their pity and their condescending smiles, was nauseating. Could I really do it? Could I walk back into that lion's den? I picked up my phone and called the one person who would understand. "Thorne," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "I got an invitation." I explained what it was, where it was. "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted, the words feeling like a betrayal of the powerful woman I had become. Thorne was silent on the other end of the line for a long beat. I could hear him breathing, thinking. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and solid, a rock in the storm of my anxiety. "Ava," he said, "listen to me. A year ago, they tried to destroy a small company run by a girl in a garage. They almost succeeded. Now the woman on this phone could buy the bank that holds their mortgage without a second thought. You are not the woman they kicked out of that Christmas dinner. You are not the ghost they think you are." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The general doesn't ask for a seat at the table, Ava. She owns it. She owns the whole damn building." His words were like a splash of cold water. He was right. The fear I felt was a phantom, a ghost of a weaker self that no longer existed. I was not going to their party as a victim. I was going as the owner. My resolve solidified, turning from doubt into a cold, diamond-hard certainty. I walked over to my desk, picked up a pen, and filled out the RSVP card. Ms. Ava Reyes will be delighted to attend. I sealed the envelope and sent it back to them. The game was on. I arrived at the Haven as the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the manicured lawns and the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The place was even more magnificent in person, a testament to understated luxury. Valets in crisp uniforms hurried to open car doors. The air hummed with the quiet chatter of wealthy, important people. I walked through the grand entrance, my simple, elegant black dress a stark contrast to the frills and sequins favored by many of the other guests. I wasn't there to impress them, I was there to observe. I spotted my family immediately. They were holding court near the towering glass windows that overlooked the sea, a tight, impenetrable circle of judgment. My father was laughing loudly at something Leo said. My mother was adjusting Chloe's dress, her face a mask of maternal pride. When they saw me approaching, a flicker of collective surprise passed over their faces. I wasn't in my usual worn-out jeans and a faded sweater. My hair was styled, my makeup was subtle but flawless, and I moved with a quiet confidence that was entirely new to them. My very presence seemed to unnerve them, throwing their familiar script into disarray. Chloe recovered first, plastering a saccharine smile on her face as she detached herself from Leo and glided toward me. "Ava, I'm so glad you could make it," she gushed, her voice loud enough for everyone in their circle to hear. "I know a place like this must be a bit of a stretch for you, but I just couldn't imagine getting married without my little sister there." Her words were a perfectly crafted insult, designed to remind me of my supposed poverty, to put me back in my place as the poor relation. Leo joined her, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "Nice to see you, Ava," he said, looking me up and down as if I were a strange insect. "Still plugging away at that thing you do?" He didn't even bother to call it a project anymore. It was just a thing. They were trying to bait me, to provoke the old insecure Ava into a clumsy emotional response. But that Ava was gone. I just smiled, a serene, unbothered expression on my face. "It's a beautiful venue, Chloe," I said, my voice calm and even as I surveyed the opulent ballroom. "You have great taste." My refusal to take the bait threw them off. They exchanged a quick, confused glance. Before they could recalibrate their attack, Leo was called away. His commanding officer had arrived. I watched as Leo immediately shifted into schmooze mode, his back straightening, his smile becoming more deferential. The man he was greeting was Brigadier General Wallace, a formidable figure with a stern face and a chest full of medals. He was a man who radiated authority, a man who clearly did not suffer fools. From across the room, I saw Leo gesture subtly in my direction as he spoke to the general. A condescending smirk was back on his face. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was painting a picture for his boss, setting the stage for my final public humiliation. He was going to have his commander witness my failure firsthand. My gaze drifted past them to a small secluded table where my Aunt Carol was sitting alone. She was watching the entire exchange, her face a mask of pale anxiety. She clutched her wine glass so tightly, her knuckles were white. She knew my family's capacity for cruelty. She knew what was coming. And, as always, she was too afraid to do anything but watch. Her silence was a part of the performance, a quiet affirmation of their power and my powerlessness. The trap was being set. The moment arrived with all the orchestrated drama of a bad play. Leo, his chest puffed out with self-importance, led Brigadier General Wallace through the crowd, making a direct line for me. He looked like a hunter bringing a prize back to his den. My parents and Chloe watched with expectant smiles, ready for the show to begin. "General," Leo began, his voice booming with false confidence, "I'd like you to meet my fiancé's sister, Ava." He paused for effect, his tone dripping with a carefully measured mix of pity and condescension. "She used to have some interest in the military world herself, you know. She had a few ideas, but it didn't quite work out for her. He had delivered the final, killing line. He had branded me a failure in front of his commanding officer. He stood back, a triumphant smirk on his face, waiting for the general to offer me a polite, dismissive nod before moving on. But that's not what happened. Brigadier General Wallace's eyes, which had been scanning the room with professional detachment, landed on me. And in an instant, everything about him changed. Any trace of casual conversation vanished. His posture, already ramrod straight, somehow became even more rigid. He took a sharp, deliberate step toward me, completely ignoring Leo and my sister. He offered me a crisp, formal, and deeply respectful nod. "Ma'am," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the nearby chatter like a razor. "It is an honor to finally meet you in person. Colonel Thorne speaks very, very highly of you." The air around us seemed to freeze. The word ma'am hung there, charged with a power that no one in my family could comprehend. Leo's jaw literally dropped. The smug, triumphant expression on his face dissolved into utter, slack-jawed shock. Chloe's perfect smile faltered, her eyes darting between me and the general in confusion. My father, who had been raising a glass of champagne to his lips, stopped mid-sip, his arm frozen in the air. General Wallace, completely oblivious to the family soap opera he had just detonated, continued, his tone one of genuine professional admiration. "My staff at Tradoc has been trying to solve the Red River supply problem for months. We heard a private firm, Apex Logistics, solved an identical issue for the energy sector in half the time and for a fraction of the cost. Your work is already becoming legendary, ma'am. The efficiency models you designed are revolutionary." Leo turned pale. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty grayish pallor. He looked like he was going to be sick. "Sir," he stammered, his voice a choked whisper. You know her." Wallace finally turned to look at him, his expression shifting from respect for me to utter confusion at his subordinate's behavior. "Know her? Captain, are you serious?" He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "We call her the General at command for a reason. Her systems are setting a new standard for the entire logistics industry. We've been trying to get her to consult for us for the last 6 months, but she's been too busy." It was at that precise, perfect moment that the resort manager, a tall, impeccably dressed man named Mr. Davis, came hurrying over. His eyes scanned the group, passing over my parents, over Chloe the bride-to-be, over the decorated army captain, and landed squarely on me. He approached with an air of deep deference, a look of someone addressing the ultimate authority. "General Reyes," he said, his voice smooth and professional, yet loud enough for everyone to hear. "I apologize for the interruption. I just wanted to confirm that everything is to your satisfaction. Your executive office in the new wing has been prepared, just as you requested." "General Reyes." The two words, spoken together, landed like a bomb in the middle of the party. The trap Leo had so carefully set for me had snapped shut on him instead. The manager's words hung in the air, electric and undeniable. "General Reyes." My mother's face, which had been glowing with pride just moments before, turned ashen. She looked at my father, her mouth opening and closing silently, forming the words she couldn't speak aloud. "General Reyes," she finally mouthed, her expression one of utter, world-shattering disbelief. Chloe stared at me, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. The triumphant smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of raw, ugly confusion. "Executive office?" she asked, her voice a high-pitched, trembling squeak. "What is he talking about, Ava? What is going on?" She wasn't asking for information. She was pleading for a return to the reality she knew, the one where she was the star and I was the nobody. Leo was completely speechless. He stood frozen, his face a ghastly shade of pale. The blood had drained from it so completely he looked like a statue. The pieces were clicking into place in his mind, each one a hammer blow to his ego and his career. The dime-a-dozen company he had so casually sabotaged. The little project he had mocked. The woman he had called a failure. He hadn't just tried to ruin a small-time nobody, he had tried to destroy a titan in the very industry his own commanding officer admired. He had committed a catastrophic, career-ending act of self-destruction, and he had done it in front of the one man who held his future in his hands. Across the room, I saw my Aunt Carol. She had witnessed the entire exchange. As the truth settled over the room, she simply sat down heavily in the nearest empty chair. A long, shuddering breath escaped her, and a look of what I could only describe as stunned, profound relief washed over her face. In that moment, she wasn't just my aunt, she was the jury, and the verdict had just been delivered. She was finally free from the burden of her fearful silence. General Wallace, a man accustomed to command and control, was now the most confused person in the room. He finally sensed the thick, toxic tension. He raised a single, questioning eyebrow. "Captain Vance," he said, his voice now cold and clipped. "Is there a problem here?" Before a sputtering Leo could respond, my mother found her voice. It was thin and reedy, the sound of her entire worldview crumbling to dust. She took a hesitant step toward me, her eyes wide and searching. "You," she began, her voice trembling. You own this resort?" I didn't need to give a speech. I didn't need to gloat. All the years of humiliation, all the cruel words and pitying looks were answered in that moment. I simply looked my mother in the eye and gave a small, simple, definitive nod. The sound of shattering glass made everyone jump. My father, his hand trembling, had dropped his champagne flute. It lay in a glittering spray of crystal and expensive bubbly on the polished floor. It was the perfect sound effect for the end of their world. The carefully constructed hierarchy of the Reyes family, the one with Chloe and Leo at the very top and me buried at the very bottom, had just been publicly, spectacularly, and irrevocably demolished. I didn't stay for the rest of the party. There was nothing left to say. I gave General Wallace a polite, professional goodbye, leaving him to deal with his now trembling subordinate. I left my family standing amidst the wreckage of their own making, their faces a gallery of shock, horror, and dawning comprehension. My final act was not one of revenge, but of closure. I walked over to my sister. She was standing frozen, her perfect engagement party in ruins around her. I leaned in close, my voice a quiet whisper meant only for her. "Congratulations on your engagement, Chloe. I hope you'll be very happy." There was no malice in my voice, no sarcasm, only finality. I was closing a door, and I had no intention of ever looking back. Later that night, I was standing on the private balcony of the penthouse suite, my executive office. My home, whenever I was here, the haven. The cool ocean breeze felt clean on my face. Thorne was with me. He had flown in that afternoon, wanting to be there, as he put it, for the fireworks. We were sharing a bottle of expensive whiskey, the good stuff, looking out at the calm, dark ocean. "They looked like they'd seen a ghost," Thorne said, a deep, satisfied smile in his voice as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. I took a sip of my own. The smooth, smoky flavor, a welcome warmth. I shook my head. "They did," I replied, my voice quiet. The ghost of the girl they thought I was. The victory didn't feel the way I thought it would. I had spent so long imagining this moment, this grand, fiery explosion of revenge where I would finally make them feel as small as they had made me feel. But standing here now, it wasn't a fiery explosion. It was quiet. It was peaceful. It was the profound, soul-deep realization that my success was never really about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself right. All those years, I had craved their approval, their validation. Now I felt nothing but a quiet indifference. Their opinions were irrelevant. My worth was never up for their negotiation. I looked out at the dark water, the moonlight tracing a silver path across the waves. I had thought power was about winning, about defeating your enemies, but I was wrong. True power isn't about making others feel small. It's the freedom to not care what they think at all. It's the peace that comes from knowing, in your own heart, and on your own terms, exactly who you are. And for the first time in my life I did. My story is proof that the labels people give you only have power if you accept them. Your true value isn't determined by someone else's opinion. It's forged in your own fire, on your own terms. What labels have you refused to accept? Let me know in the comments below. I want to hear your stories. And if this story resonated with you, Please hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about overcoming the odds. Thanks for watching.